Have you ever noticed how people spend their entire lives building a safety net made of people? Children who need to call, a partner who needs to be by their side, friends who need to remember your birthday. And a certain age arrives, and all that engineering begins to creak. The phone rings less often, the chairs at the table empty out. And most interpret this as abandonment. Carl Jung saw something far more uncomfortable. You are not being abandoned. You are discovering, too late, that you built your old age upon people who were always transient. No one was made to carry the weight of your soul. And what you call loneliness is, in truth, the invoice for a lifetime of outsourcing your own center. This video is not about finding new people to fill the void. It is about understanding why, according to Jung, a peaceful old age does not depend on a partner, on children, or on friends. It depends on exactly 4 internal things. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you already suspects this. The first illusion to be dissected is the oldest of all. The idea that aging well means having people around. You were taught since childhood that old age is measured in family photos, in grandchildren running through the living room, in Sunday dinners with many people at the table. And based on that promise, you made silent existential calculations. I married so as not to grow old alone. I had children to have company later. I maintained friendships that no longer nourish me because one day I will need them. Notice the cruelty of this logic. You turned people into emotional insurance policies, and then you are surprised when they don't pay the claim. The cold truth, which Jung never hid, is that anyone can leave. A partner dies, falls ill, drifts away, or simply changes. Children grow up, create their own lives, and have no cosmic obligation to fill the existential hole that you did not know how to fill in yourself. Friends move, follow other paths, or lose interest when you stop serving the role you played in their lives, not because they are traitors, but because they are human, finite, with their own internal hungers. A secure old age is not the one with the most people around. It is the one with the most roots within. And as long as you believe that another person is your root, you live in the psychological condition of a hostage. A single loss is enough for your entire floor to collapse. Jung would call this a life lived on the periphery of oneself, an existence revolving around everything except its own center. And the price of this outsourcing doesn't arrive when you are 30 or 40. It arrives when the body slows down, when the world stops asking things of you, when the silence previously muffled by the rush finally gains volume. That is when the bill knocks on the door. And most discover late that they never learned how to even be with themselves for 10 minutes without looking for a cell phone, a television, or any distraction at all. This leads us to the first of the 4 riches that Jung pointed out as non-negotiable for a peaceful old age: the capacity to be alone with oneself. And here, a surgical distinction must be made. It is not loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of someone who has been abandoned from within. Solitude is the privilege of someone who has finally found themselves. One is absence, the other is presence. And almost no one knows which of the two they are living because they never stopped long enough to ask. Observe your own behavior. What do you do in the first 3 seconds when you are without stimulus? You pick up your phone. You turn on the television without paying attention. You open the refrigerator without hunger. You make a call to someone you don't even know what to say to. This is not habit. This is escape. It is clinical evidence that your own company has become unbearable. And the reason is simple. When you remain in silence, everything you spent your life burying begins to rise. The questions you avoided, the decisions you postponed, the pains you wrapped in pretty packages and kept in the back of the closet. Jung would observe this phenomenon with an almost icy calm. He would say that the things you buried to be accepted do not die. They merely change addresses. They move into your unconscious, and from there they leak out as insomnia, as irritation without cause, as that vague discomfort that forces you to always be doing something. You are not anxious because life is hectic. You are hectic because if you stop, you encounter someone you abandoned decades ago, yourself. The person who learns to be in silence is not learning to endure boredom. They are learning to endure the truth. And that is one of the rarest skills in the modern world. Whoever achieves this discovers a security that no company can offer. They discover that the silence, once threatening, begins to feel like an old friend. They discover that their own mind, once a hostile territory, can become a home. And whoever has this home does not fear being alone, because they never are. But I need to be honest with you now. None of this happens by chance. No one wakes up from one day to the next with this capacity to inhabit themselves. It requires a method, a daily practice, a direction, and that is why I prepared O Código do Despertar for you. If you recognized, even for a second, this flight from your own silence, this discomfort at being with yourself, this tiredness of performing a version of yourself for others, then this discomfort is not a flaw. It is a calling. It is your unconscious knocking on the door asking for passage. O Código do Despertar is a 60-day path based on Jungian psychology with a daily lesson that brings keys, questions, and declarations to guide you from restlessness to direction. You read, execute the micro-action of the day and record it in your journal. And day after day, the inner map begins to draw itself. It is the practical path of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are before life collects the bill in the final silence of old age. The link is in the first pinned comment of this video. If you feel that this is the moment, leave a comment with the word present. It is your first symbolic gesture of commitment to yourself. And here we reach the second richness, which is even more delicate because almost no one is willing to do the work it demands. Reconciliation with one's own past. There is a comfortable myth that time heals, that you just have to wait, and the wounds close on their own. Jung would laugh at this idea with that cold irony of his. Time, by itself, heals absolutely nothing. Time only pushes the wound into deeper layers, where it stops hurting in the conscious mind and begins to govern the unconscious. You no longer remember what happened at 20, but you still live choosing partners who repeat the same pattern. You no longer think about what your father did, but you freeze every time someone in a position of authority speaks loudly near you. You have already forgiven, apparently, but your body stiffens when you hear that person's name. This is not weakness. It is evidence that the wound was never treated. It was merely anesthetized. And old age has a cruel characteristic. The anesthesia begins to wear off. When the pace of life slows down, when distractions diminish, when the body stops screaming louder than the soul, all these buried pains return to the surface with interest. This is why so many elderly people become bitter. Not because aging is bitter, but because without internal work, what surfaces is the deposit of decades of unresolved matters. Guilt over old decisions, resentment against dead people, regret for paths not taken, anger at oneself for not having had courage. Reconciliation in the Jungian sense is not pretending nothing happened. It is not the performative forgiveness that cheap spirituality sells. It is something much harder. It is looking at your own history face to face without embellishing, without blaming only others, without placing yourself as a perpetual victim. It is owning your part. It is recognizing that, in many moments, you were the author of your own pain, and that in others you were a victim of things you did not choose, but which now only you can transform. To reconcile is to transform each episode into learning, not into an excuse, not into an open scar, into the raw material of wisdom. The person who does this reaches old age with a clear conscience, not because life was perfect, but because they finally stopped fighting with what was. And whoever stops fighting with the past releases an amount of psychic energy that most don't even know exists. This energy is the fuel of peace in old age. It is not luck, it is work. And if you realized while I was speaking that your past still pulses as if it were yesterday, know that this is the exact sign that a blockage still exists. O Código do Despertar has specific lessons for this reconciliation day after day, without violence, without aggressive therapy. First pinned comment: do not let the unconscious choose the moment when this pain will return. Choose it yourself. The third richness is perhaps the most painful to face, because it directly attacks the identity you spent decades building, freeing yourself from the need to be indispensable. Notice how almost your entire notion of value has been outsourced. You feel useful when your children call you asking for advice. You feel important when someone at work depends on you. You feel loved when you are sought after. And on the reverse of that, you feel invisible, discarded, hollowed out, when no one needs you anymore. Jung would look at this arrangement and say, with the calm of someone describing gravity, you did not build an identity, you built a function, and functions are replaceable. People with real identity are not. This is the difference between existing and serving. And old age is the phase that, without mercy, strips away your functions one by one. You retire, and the professional function dissolves. The children grow up, and the role of provider becomes decorative. The partner departs, and the role of companion loses its object. And if, beneath those functions, a real person does not exist, what remains is a shell. This is why so many people fall into deep depression upon retiring. It is not the end of work that destroys them, it is the end of the function. It is the terrible discovery that without being useful, they do not know who they are. The exhaustion you feel when doing endless favors is not physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion of maintaining a borrowed identity. It is the fatigue of performing usefulness so as not to disappear in the eyes of others. And every time you say yes when you wanted to say no, you are paying a small installment on that unconscious contract. I exist because I am useful. On the day I cease to be useful, I will cease to exist. This contract needs to be torn up before old age, because if you reach old age still signing that contract, the world will declare your emotional bankruptcy, not because people are cruel, but because life naturally diminishes the demands on a slower body, on an emptier schedule, on a less central presence. And if your value was in the flow of demands, and the flow dries up, your value dries up with it. Freeing yourself from this need is not becoming selfish. It is discovering a purpose that continues to exist even when no one depends on you anymore. A purpose that does not need an audience, that sustains itself in silence, that sustains itself in you, cultivating what still wants to bloom, creating what still wants to be born, learning what still wants to be learned. This is not a hobby, it is psychic survival. It is the difference between aging with a spark in your eyes and aging with GU look, that extinguished gaze seen in so many who spent their lives being indispensable to others and were never important to themselves. And we reach the fourth richness, which is perhaps the most misinterpreted of all, learning to love without turning the other into a source of security, because there is a type of love that, disguised as dedication, is merely dependency in pretty clothes. It is the love that demands, that controls, that needs to know where the person is, who they are talking to, what they feel, if they still like you. It is the love that treats the other as an emotional crutch, as a mood stabilizer, as medicine for an anxiety that the person never had the courage to face alone. Jung would say, with that uncomfortable precision, that most relationships are not built on love. They are built on unconscious psychological contracts. You give me security, and I give you approval. You make me feel less alone, and I pretend not to see your flaws. You distract me from my empty life, and I give you the illusion of purpose. And as long as this contract works, we call it love. But it only takes one of the parties to start changing, growing, wanting air, and the contract collapses, and then we accuse the other person of having changed, of having betrayed, of having stopped loving, when in truth they merely stopped fulfilling the role of emotional provider that should never have been theirs. True love, in the Jungian sense, is radically different. It begins with a non-negotiable prerequisite. Your emotional stability is already standing before the other appears. You are already enough for yourself. You already love yourself. You already embrace yourself. And from that solid base the other is added, never subtracted. You do not love because you need to. You love because you have. And there is an abysmal difference between loving out of overflow and loving out of lack. He who loves out of lack consumes. He who loves out of overflow offers. In old age, this type of love is practically impossible to improvise. Either you arrived there with this maturity, or you will reproduce the same patterns of demand, control, and pressure that made your relationships exhausting your whole life. And then you blame age. You blame the era. You blame the new generation, when the problem was never external. The problem is that you never learned to be a complete home within. and no one can inhabit you if you yourself do not live there yet. To love with freedom is to allow the other to exist without carrying the weight of your stability. It is to respect their individual path. It is to accept that they may leave, and that, if they leave, you remain whole, aching but whole, wounded but standing. And this is the only form of love that withstands old age, because it is the only one that does not depend on the constant physical presence of the other to sustain itself. And if now you are beginning to realize that perhaps you have lived your whole life loving out of lack, that perhaps you have outsourced your emotional security to people who could never sustain it, that perhaps you are still fulfilling psychological contracts that expired decades ago, then this is the exact moment to act. Not tomorrow, not later, now. O Código do Despertar was built for this crossing. It is 60 days in which you stop revolving around the void and start building a center. Each lesson, each micro-action, each journal entry is a brick of this internal house that you should have started building a long time ago. Old age does not forgive those who arrive disassembled, and to postpone this is to choose to arrive that way. The link is in the first pinned comment. The decision to open that link is the first act of someone who has finally chosen to no longer outsource their own awakening. Choosing not to open it is also a decision. Only the invoice for that second decision arrives at a time when it is no longer possible to renegotiate. And we reach the question that traverses the entire second half of life. The question that Jung asked his older patients with that low voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. Who are you when you lose everything you used to define your value? Who are you without the work badge? Without the title of active father or mother? Without the role of beloved partner? Without the function of indispensable friend? Without social recognition? Without the applause? Without the likes? Without the audience? When all of that is removed, and life makes a point of removing it, what remains? If the answer is nothing, then there was never anyone there. There was only a sequence of masks switching positions to please different contexts. One persona at work, another persona at home, another persona on social media, another persona at Sunday dinners. And at the center of this constellation of masks, the silent void of someone who never had the time, courage, or method to discover themselves. Maturity, in the deepest sense, is not accumulating experiences, it is subtracting illusions. It is discovering the part of you that never depended on recognition, on control, on approval, on external presence. That part exists. It has always existed. It was only buried by decades of performance, and the encounter with that part is what Jung called individuation. It is not becoming better. It is finally being you. It is not accumulating virtues. It is recognizing yourself as whole with light and shadow, without needing to edit anything anymore to be accepted. And it is this person, this indestructible core, who ages in peace. Because when this core is standing, the partner becomes company, not a crutch. The children become a presence, not an obligation. Friends become a luxury, not a necessity. And loneliness becomes solitude. And old age becomes finally what it always should have been, the freest phase of life, not the most terrifying. The freest, because it is the only phase in which you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You no longer need to perform. You no longer need to win, you only need to be. And being is the rarest thing in the world, because almost no one learned how. You can close this video now and go back to the old engineering. Go back to demanding from others what only you can give yourself. Go back to accumulating psychological contracts that will collect the bill in your old age. Or you can accept that the illusion is over, that no one is going to save you from the silence that approaches, and that the only possible answer to Jung's question is to begin today the work of discovering who you are when no one else is looking. The choice is yours, and contrary to what you learned, it cannot be outsourced.